All right, we're live. Talking about Jimmy Kimmel, the late night host who has been indefinitely suspended by ABC following remarks about Charlie Kirk. So, the question of the day is, did Donald Trump kill the First Amendment on Constitution Day? So some people are saying, or is he just maybe doing a more blatant version of something that Joe Biden already did? Welcome to a special live edition of the Reason Roundtable. This is your online review of news and culture from the editors of Reason Magazine. I am your host, Peter Suderman, and today I am joined by Reason's very own, the one, the only, the great, Matt Welch. Thanks for joining me, Matt.
Thank you, and I'm sorry I didn't put cotton in my ears ahead of time, Peter, but let's go.
You don't need the cotton. Volume is a feature of this podcast, as always. We bring the passion and the intensity.
Here, yes.
All right. Thank you all for tuning in to watch this today. We are going to be taking questions at the end, so stick around if you want to ask us something. All right. Let's talk about Jimmy Kimmel. He made some comments about Charlie Kirk's killer, linking them to MAGA. As we know, Utah Governor Spencer Cox has said the alleged killer was some sort of leftist or influenced by leftist ideology. People were kind of upset by that. So then yesterday, the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, Brendan Carr, said that Disney, which is the parent company of ABC, has a problem with Kimmel or something to that effect. And Carr mentioned calls for Kimmel to be fired, said maybe a suspension would be reasonable here, right? Kind of brought up that, I don't know, what are you going to do? But that seems reasonable to me. And he called for individual licensed stations to step up. He said, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. I don't know, that sounds kind of like a threat to me. And then hours later, the affiliate networks chose to do it the easy way, I guess. They said they were not going to air Kimmel. A couple of the big affiliates said that. And so shortly after that, ABC said he was being yanked from the air indefinitely. Is this a suspension? Is this a cancellation? A little bit hard to say. But he's off the air for as far as the eye can see here, right? And so critics are saying that this is basically government bullying. It's tantamount to censorship. And then there's all these other defenders saying, look, this is the private market at work. The affiliates were upset by his remarks. They were responding to what they view as their customer base, their viewers, right? And once the affiliates said they wouldn't air Kimmel's show, ABC just sort of followed suit here. So Matt Welch, you are a free speech guy. Is this government bullying, coercion, or is it just the market at work responding to some offensive remarks?
This isn't really hard. The head of the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, which for some reason still exists and has regulatory authority over big broadcast companies, as does the Federal Trade Commission in the approval of mergers, which is also kind of brought up and has a influence on this particular subject. The head of the FCC decided that he didn't like a late night comedian's joke and made a very direct comments about what should be done in response to that by the people who broadcast that, and then suggested that there might be government action if he didn't like their response. That response was taken by two different groups that have mergers in front of the FTC and have reason to not want the government to be on their bad side. And after Jimmy Kimmel was removed from the air, very suddenly, at the last, he had an audience full of people that were streaming in, waiting for his latest unfunny show to come on. After this happened, Brendan Carr absolutely spiked the football, as did the president of the United States. This is the government telling and threatening a broadcast company, you better fire the unfunny comedian for saying something I didn't like, or else. And anyone who is trying to bend their mind in pretzels to say this is exclusively a private sector event are advertising their seriousness, by which I mean they have none.
So he didn't quite say, you have to fire this guy. He didn't quite say, this is what I demand. He just sort of said, well, Disney has a problem, and I would recommend, I mean, the words he used were that the affiliates, the licensed networks, step up, right? He was calling for some sort of action from the licensed networks, but he wasn't saying that I definitely will do something if you don't do this. He was saying, this seems like a reasonable response to me. And so I think people are kind of choosing to interpret that as, well, this wasn't pressure. This wasn't, or maybe it was pressure, but it wasn't government action directly causing this. This is not direct government censorship.
the relevant government authority singling out a comedian for a single set of words and suggesting that private sector action should happen or else the government is going to have to get involved. What do you want? He didn't put a gun in his hand and pull the trigger. Correct. He didn't. But he is someone who has authority. There was a time, a really long time ago, let's see, it was last year, in which most conservatives, most Republicans, all libertarians thought it was a really bad idea when the federal government and various actors in the federal government put pressure on social media companies to suppress voices that they accused of spreading misinformation, particularly as regards to any policy regarding COVID-19, and then also election-related misinformation. But it was mostly COVID-19 stuff. And they didn't say, you have to fire Joe Rogan. They just said he was one of the dirty dozen of people who are spreading misinformation, and it really ought to be a priority. They need to go further, these social media companies, in kicking people off of their platforms. Hey, they didn't do that. So what we called that in that period of time was jawboning. It was the federal government jawboning, by meaning making heavy suggestions over and over again towards companies that have a hell of a lot of business in front of the federal government in terms of regulatory business. So they didn't, quite unlike Brendan Carr, for the most part, suggest that there would be regulatory remedies based on this one thing. They usually put that off as just, well, we just think this is a good idea. And, so that's a good idea. That was enough for almost all conservatives and Republicans who paid attention to the situation 1 year ago to say that's tantamount to censorship, by indirect censorship or jawboning censorship. It isn't, we are going to punish you directly if you don't do this one thing, but it is, boy, you really better do that one thing. Oh, and by the way, you have a lot of regulatory business in front of us. So what Brendan Carr did is a step further, is that he was way more specific and blatant in doing it. And the fact that he and Donald Trump again celebrated this, and Donald Trump went further to say, all right, now the next one to go is this and this. And oh, by the way, Donald Trump is busy filing personal lawsuits against various people. And Brendan Carr has spent a lot of time in his really, really lousy chairmanship singling out the editorial decisions of various companies and suggesting that because of those editorial decisions, that the federal government has a business into investigating whether they still deserve the same kind of treatment under their licenses. That is far more direct than the action, which was already terrible and pervasive and bad. And Reason wrote 50 trillion stories about this in real time. I went on CNN 12 months ago, 14 months ago, and I was outnumbered by absolutely everybody there by suggesting that the federal government has no fucking business doing anything like this, that we shouldn't be journalists for censorship, that it's a bad idea when the government is doing things like this. So for my opinion journalism friends who are discovering FAFO responses to this, I see you, I'm laughing at you, and I have no respect for you.
Okay, so there's a huge amount of stuff that you brought up that I want to get to and respond to and sort of unpack there. But actually, I want to start with a little bit of a correction. You said that conservatives were against this last year. And I actually have Donald Trump's executive order on restoring free speech in America from January of this year, of 2025, and it is something to behold in this moment here, because it says the First Amendment to the United States Constitution enshrines the right of the American people to speak freely in the public square without government interference. And then it says, over the last 4 years, the previous administration trampled free speech rights by censoring American speech on online platforms, often by exerting substantial coercive pressure on third parties. That is what is happening here.
Third parties, coercive pressure on third. This is coercive pressure on second parties.
Yeah,
I think it's fair enough, if not quite first parties. Also, note I think the section 3 or section C of this first day executive order, which even though I applauded the spirit of it. I also wanted it to be accompanied by a laugh track, given the voluminous history of especially the president of the United States, but also the rising trend among national conservatives to want to, use the FTC to go after big tech businesses and a bunch of other things, repeal Section 230. We can argue about those things, and we won't on this podcast, but they had developed a new appetite for regulation to the extent that by 2018, the great Tom Hazlitt was writing about this for Reason and warning about this new intellectual trend. So it deserved a little bit of a laugh track, but Section C or Section 3 of this also prohibited the government from engaging in anything like censorship. Okay, you've just written your toothless executive order prohibiting the action that you took later. And the other part of 2025 in which this contradicts was, of course, J.D. Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference back in, I believe, March, but earlier this year, in which it was a security conference, which might not have been the best venue, but he issued a very robust critique, rightly so, against European backsliding on free speech, and the way to try to criminalize opposition parties and dissent and a bunch of other things. And we've seen horror after horror in the UK and other places on speech. He was right about that. I wish he would apply that same kind of analysis to what he is doing and applauding right now in the United States of America, but he will not. And as usual, don't depend on certainly major party politicians to have any consistency on free speech issues, unless the consistency is, yeah, when I'm in charge, I'm going to pick up the club and beat you in the neck.
That J.D. Vance speech at the Munich Security Conference is amazing because he went really hard after European backsliding on speech, said, you are the winners of the Cold War. This is the heirs to kind of Western liberalism, and you are terrible on this fundamental right. And in Donald Trump's Washington, we're not going to be. The quote that I pulled from that speech is, in Washington, there is a new sheriff in town, and under Donald Trump's leadership, we may disagree with your views, but we will fight to defend your right to offer them in the public square, agree or disagree. And they're clearly not fighting. They're fighting to stop people from offering those views that they disagree with in the public square.
And it's a consistent, and it's not just like late night comedians. It is law firms who dare to represent people who took the other side of cases that had to do either with the Trump administration, Trump himself, or just issues that they care about. There are law firms that were hit with, hey, you're not going to be able to come into a federal building. Federal buildings. What's in federal buildings? I don't know. Courts. Your law firm is not going to be able to come into a federal building unless you start doing some pro bono work for Republican causes. Seriously, that has happened this year, and most of those law firms caved because they want to be able to get into federal buildings, and because people are busy trying to make nice with the Trump administration, as they are in the media industry. So don't give me this garbage, Mr. Vance, about how we're just going to defend your right to say this and to act in your free associative way and in your free speech way. Accept. We're seeing all the accepts, and we're going to see a lot more going forward, and it's going to test the resiliency of people, and hopefully it'll suggest to those who have been who picked up the cudgel to an, I think, unprecedented, or at least newly extensive degree during the Biden administration between 2021 and 2023, just widespread abuse of government power to curtail free speech, to convince platforms to kick Rand Paul off of YouTube for daring to suggest that masks don't always work, among other things. All that stuff happened. So what I would suggest is that maybe some of the people who are reeling right now, maybe some of the people who are saying this is really terrible, should go back, look at their own record, and see how much they were cheering on Fox News losing its broadcast license. That was a thing that was suggested pretty heavily during the Biden administration. Go back and look to see how they wanted to sick the FCC and the FTC on various properties. and then maybe come to a different conclusion. And here's the conclusion. And it's one that I remember Jeff Jarvis coming to during the second Bush administration when he did a cover story, I believe, for the Nation magazine saying, fuck the FCC. And again, sorry to cuss, not sorry. But I'm just quoting the Nation magazine. This is a healthy attitude to take. How has the FCC been used? How have, these ideas about the public interest, beneath the public interest, which suddenly Brendan Carr, the clown robot who's in charge of the FCC, is very, very excited about? How has public interest been used? Public interest was used to block the development of cable news before it started, to block the development of FM radio, to block the use of cellular frequencies. We developed that stuff decades ago. And the FCC, well, that's going to hurt the public interest of the existing, broadcast license holders. So we don't want all this competition coming in. As soon as a politician or someone appointed by a politician is talking about media regulation in the name of public interest, reach for your wallet or your battering ram and get ready for someone to act in a explicitly censorious way that blunts the development of the free speech industry.
Okay, the public interest standard here is quite relevant. And if you watched Brendan Carr defend his decision on television today, what he said was that he's reinvigorating the FCC's interest in enforcing the public interest standard, and that this is different than what was happening in the Biden era, and that this is not the same kind of jawboning because these are public airwaves that the licensees are essentially renting from the government. And so they have a kind of a public obligation to tell the truth, to be fair, to be reasonable, and that makes this in some sense different. I mean, Brendan Carr even said, look, we're not trying to censor Jimmy Kimmel. What we're saying is this is not okay. We disapprove of this on public airwaves. If he wants to get a YouTube show, he can say whatever he wants. That's why we can say fuck here, because we are not censored by the FCC because we're on YouTube. And so does that in your mind make this any different here? Because I do think that there is, at least legally speaking, there is some kind of a difference.
Legally, sadly, the FCC still has limited ability to regulate what happens on terrestrial airwaves. I think that's ripe for challenge, and that eventually will be challenged because how many people are using rabbit ears out here? How many people are conscious of the different delivery systems of how these things work?
Just to quickly check in here, I don't know how old our audience is, but this is YouTube. I assume it is not that old. Do people even know what rabbit ears are? Do you remember,
yes.
There was a time, even in my lifetime, and I'm not that old, where you had to get, where it was, I shouldn't say you had to, but it was possible. Many people got their television by sticking up basically like two little radio antennas on the top of their TV that would maybe get the reception or maybe not. And that's what the public, that's what all of this legal standard comes out of, is the era when that was the norm. There were basically only three networks, and they were just the broadcast networks.
So there have been a series of both deregulations and some court cases that have freed up the illiberal standards created by both FCC regulation and the public interest standard, the fair use standard, the equal time standard, all of which were used to suppress voices and to prevent there being actual political debate on television and just political coverage in general. That's how it worked out in effect, despite the highfalutin discussion of it. So that's been weakened a lot, and I think that's vulnerable to the Supreme Court challenge. The Supreme Court, up until very recently, has been very, very strong on free speech. I would argue that their ruling, which was more about standing in the Murphy versus Missouri case last year, the jawboning case that went to Supreme Court, was a backslide from that, and we're actually now having to deal with the results of that with these actions. But so there is that the terrestrial legal fig leaf. I think it's constitutionally vulnerable, but at least it is something that Brendan Carr has that he does not have over cable television yet. I mean, let's keep in mind that the government also has great regulatory authority when it comes to mergers, approving, especially now. That
let's talk about this because this comes on the heels, right? Of the CBS settlement, right?
I want to finish the thought about terrestrial with a not very difficult thought experiment, which is to say, who runs terrestrial stuff, and who is in fact a player in this particular case. Sinclair Broadcast Group owns a bunch of ABC affiliates. Sinclair Broadcast Group, as recently as a few years ago, I think it was during the Biden administration, and it might have even been before, came under intense pressure by Democrats to maybe break up the monopoly, as they described it, or to do something about them regulatorily, perhaps even in the name of public interest, because they had, if memory serves, the same like super conservative right wing editorial read like a hostage note by all 187 stations that they did. Freaked everybody out, like, oh my god, this is terrible programming. Reason, as we always do, resisted calls from politicians on the left to try to use their content and political objections to overregulate people in media in the name of public interest. This is how it will be used. If this becomes a legal standard, Republicans will lose elections again, and it will be used. Elizabeth Warren would love to kick Fox off, to remove Fox News off its broadcast license. She suggested it many, many times. So that's how it will be used. Now, FTC stuff is that the media is it's a mostly collapsing industry, as it overlaps with entertainment, as it does with what's the name of the stupid company, Skydance,
Paramount, Skydance.
Paramount, Skydance,
there's a merger, right?
This is so these companies are large companies with a lot of entertainment holdings, some of which they want to keep, some of which they want to hive off, so it's not doesn't inflame the sensibilities of, I don't know, thin-skinned presidents. And so those mergers have to go in front of the Federal Trade Commission for approval. 5, 6, 7 years ago, that was a pretty routine thing, and almost always a media company would get it. And this keep in mind, this is also newspapers getting approval for buying a local radio station, which is a heavily regulated sector of life for reasons that make no sense now, and in many cases didn't make any sense at the beginning of it, and which, oh, by the way, Richard Nixon tried to use to crack down on the Washington Post during the Watergate coverage, among other things. So this is a tool that an unscrupulous administration will use in order to try to hold this up. Well, I don't know if I'm going to approve this merger. Maybe if you do this and that. I think it was the Skydance Paramount merger that led directly to the creation, at the administration's suggestion, of an ombudsman who would check out the political content on CBS. What are we doing here, people? Seriously, those who are cheering this on, you're like, you know what's really cool? Let's have the federal government suggest, and maybe even suggest personnel for, who knows, a creation of an ombudsman to make sure that you're not being biased in what you do. The lack of imagination, in addition to the lack of any kind of legal or philosophical consistency, is appalling. And the best that most of these people got right now is like, yeah, but you didn't say this when then. And they deliberately, in those things, don't ever talk about libertarians, because they know we said it every time, and we're saying it this time, and we're holding up a mirror in front of their faces.
So the argument you are making is that if you think this is okay, if you think that this legal standard, the public interest standard, is being wielded in a way that is essentially appropriate, that it is good to kind of threaten the affiliates and get Jimmy Kimmel kicked off the air, that even if you think that's good, if you're on the right, if you're a MAGA person, that's going to be turned on you eventually when Democrats take power again, as at some point they inevitably will. And whenever I make this argument now, the response I always hear from MAGA types, from people who are behind Donald Trump or sort of in favor of moves like this, what they say is, look, if we restrain ourselves now, if we tie our hands and don't use these weapons, they're still going to come back at us when they're in charge. So we better make our move now. We better fire the first shot while we do have the power. What do you say?
Yes, and the other argument is that, well, they've been doing it anyways, and they will point to a variety of things, some of them related and some of them not. The Roseanne Barr getting fired, I don't think was a question of the Biden administration or governmental forces pressuring people because she had made or had unearthed some insane, I think, anti-Semitic tweet. But at the time, she had a very popular show. But I don't think this was a government jawboning case. But I think Republicans or conservatives, and definitely MAGA, when they see the other side, they mean all of the culture that is associated with the other side. So in that argument, like all of the madness that took place in the summer of 2020 in media companies where, heads of poetry magazines were being bounced because they were insufficiently denunciatory of racism or something. And there were dozens and dozens of examples of this that were appalling and terrible. And again, I think I remember who wrote about that in real time. So they will use that and say, well, that was the left doing that. So what standing does the left have in criticizing this? And they will find definitely a lot of areas of hypocrisy. What they will find if they look really hard is areas of their own hypocrisy because they criticized it then and they're not doing it now. That is pure will to power stuff. That is part of the ongoing, basically dropping interest, dropping any kind of sense of patience with the boring stuff of constitutional government, of enlightenment due process, of these are the steps that you need to go through in order to adjudicate disputes among people who disagree with one another in public. It is much more smash mouth. There's the stick. I'm going to swing it. And I will do that because the only thing that we can actually do is defeat once and for all our enemies. And don't really have to go too far back in recent history where that mindset is not so great when applied in general by people, especially if they're feeling particularly apocalyptic and hyperbolic about the evil of the people they're opposing. So it's all bad. And I welcome people to rediscover two notions. One is whatever kind of consistent sort of normal constitutional norms related libertarianish government principles that one can have. But
Wait,
also,
are you doing what about my norms, Matt Welch?
I am. Norms are good. Norms are better than not norms.
For free speech in particular.
And free speech in particular, because if, I was just rereading a piece that I wrote, I think about Sinclair, and this is 2017, maybe 2018. And I was working through, and Ajit Pai at this point, actually it was pre-Sinclair. It was Donald Trump suggested, and other people in the administration suggested that maybe NBC should have its license removed. And Ajit Pai, a much better chairman of the FCC than Brendan Clown Pants Carr.
And a Trump pick for people who don't have their FCC chairmans memorized here. Someone who was picked by Trump and supported Trump.
Said, yeah, we're not going to do that. That's against the legal and cultural norms that this country was founded on. He was correct. Sadly, that would, Democrats and lefties remember this for a half a second, and then they associated him with net neutrality, being the thing that was going to drive them into the concentration camps. And he received all kinds of death threats, and we had mania in a different direction. But Ajit Pai was correct there. And when I was rereading what I wrote at the time, I'm like, look, trying to figure out the severity of what Trump has just suggested. It's bad that he did it. Also, even his own FCC chair doesn't want him to do it. The Supreme Court probably would block him. And I was working through what are the possibilities, but then there's possibility number 5. What does this do to the long-term climate for ideas and culture like this? And I think right now we are reaping that. Donald Trump has been suggesting stuff like this since he became a prominent politician in this country. Always, right? There's a reason why everyone went crazy against Pam Bondi. Everyone, people on the right, went crazy at Pam Bondi talking about hate speech because they remembered that they have been fighting against this notion of hate speech for a really, really long time, and rightly so. It doesn't exist as a legal category in this country, and it's used frequently to target the speech of conservatives and Republicans.
Your namesake, in fact, Matt Walsh, had a pretty good response to Bondi's suggestion about hate speech, because, this is a guy who has done a huge amount of stuff on trans issues, and I think just understands that if Democrats are in power, that is going to be used against him.
A rare Matt Walsh crossover event. Indeed, it was for that. But note what I think part of the vociferousness of the criticism of Pam Bondi was so that they could criticize this concept without like criticizing the person more consequentially who holds the same position, which is Donald Trump. And it's because I mean, some people do. Oh, the Charlie Cooks of National Review do. Some other people do as well, and I appreciate all of them for voicing their principle. But I would say the vast majority of, or a large majority of the people that I saw criticize Pam Bondi are not using the same kind of criticism against the actual president of the United States, who has had many opportunities to weigh in on Pam Bondi's idea of hate speech this week, and usually responds with something like, well, maybe you're doing hate speech to me right now. Maybe we should investigate you right now. The president still holds this power that people are afraid of on the right. And this is limiting their ability to make arguments from principle because they're retreating from it in the face of pragmatic power politics.
All right, we've been going for about a half an hour. I want to take some questions here. Just get you to respond to a couple of things that people are saying in our comments here. We're going to start with one. I just think this is funny from Pauline, who writes, "All late night shows should be canceled." Okay, maybe I don't. This is maybe not my decision. And Donald Trump should be banned from being a human being.
I think the latter one's a little bit too strong.
Yeah.
It depends on who does private sector ban, public sector ban. I think the late night shows are uniformly terrible.
Being banned from being a human by the government or by the private sector, you can take that too far.
It feels a little bit too strong. Or Donald Trump should just have a late night television show and nothing else. I think that might maybe satisfy.
I mean, he is obviously kind of jealous. All right, I want to go to two other folks here who I think are, in some ways, these are kind of connected. Mac writes, what are some policies or protections that could be implemented to avoid future problems with private citizens and free speech clashes with the executive? Right, so like, what can you do here? What is the way to prevent this sort of thing from happening again?
I think that the best thing to happen, and so therefore the least likely to happen, is that the Congress, this is the legislative branch of the United States. You can look it up in the Constitution. They talk about it.
I've heard of it.
Should do what the Congress did a lot of in the 1970s and 1980s, which is, or at least enough of to get the ball rolling, is to pass bipartisan legislation saying, you know what, this governmental entity that was created in the 1920s in the name of reason X, but in the absence of technology Y, that this governmental body ended up being an engine for the cartelization of the industry that grew up around it, that it specifically limited, and then became semi-captured by. That maybe shouldn't exist anymore. We saw this with the Civilian Aviation Authority in the 1970s, and that led to the deregulation of airlines. We should see that with the FCC. The FCC's, as far as I can tell, the main function left that has any real purpose at all is some amount of spectrum management as you figure out what new parts to auction off. And I'm already exposing my technological superiority when I say all of this, but there really isn't much left, and that it will be used as a bludgeon like it has been this week in the absence of it being shut down. It should just be shut down. And when you remove that authority, that is the beginning. Removing the authority of the FTC, which is going to be used by both parties in this bipartisan populist moment, is a little bit more difficult. But at least if you go after the FCC, then certainly you will stop some of the potential harassment of smaller characters. The FTC is mostly involved with gigantic mergers. Most media isn't gigantic mergers, especially now that media is collapsing all around us. So abolishing the FCC is a very interesting, good start, obviously insufficient.
So let's take some critics here. There's not everyone in our comments agrees with us. So we have Bunker, apologies if I'm mispronouncing this, who just writes, Kimmel isn't censorship, it's market forces. And then we've got another comment from Abraham, who writes, it doesn't seem to raise any freedom of speech issues. It raises issues of sponsorship and company responsibility to the free market issues. Government hasn't filed any charges. No police have been called. I mean, this is, again, the sort of the argument that we keep hearing. And there's other folks who are asking, well, is there a steelman case on the other side? I think that's what we've been kind of trying to get at here is, we want to respond to the arguments being made by Brendan Carr, by the people who are on the MAGA side of this. And they're saying, well, look, what Brendan Carr did is basically irrelevant to this. This is just a market issue. That is their case. You obviously disagree with this. I disagree with this, Matt Welch.
This case has been, similar cases have been adjudicated even at the Supreme Court level, including a 9-0 case. I think it was DRB or DRV. Forgive me for not getting it correctly. In which it doesn't have to be do this or I pull this regulatory trigger. It could just be do this or you will find yourself probably under some governmental response. And rulings consistently have held that counts too. That also is the against the First Amendment idea that Congress shall pass no law concerning the freedom of the speech. This is infringing on the freedom of the speech. You're saying that I am going to use government force. I'm not going to spell it out necessarily. But if you don't do this, the market forces one, it's interesting because I think the market forces are at work. And in fact, were at work and have been at work. Yeah. Jimmy Kimmel has something like half his audience that he did about 18 months ago. Late night comedy is dreary. It is getting pummeled. Greg Gutfeld is leading the late night comedy ratings on Fox News every night. That is appalling. And if and when Greg Gutfeld becomes the target of Democrats wishing to punish him in any way, I will go to the barricades for him as well. And I happen to like him a little bit more than I like Jimmy Kimmel. And I will similarly, if that is the case, not foreground my artistic impressions of either, because that's not the point. If the government is pressuring an individual journalist to be fired or a government official, that's bad. And if it's at all in that process suggesting that there's going to be some kind of potential regulatory reaction specifically to a piece of speech, that's more than bad. That is terrible. But market forces were working. They were working fine. All these guys are so overpaid and so underwatched that it just sort of becomes impossible. Like, Stephen Colbert was canceled earlier this year, and a lot of people tried to make this a big, like, oh, this is because of Trump. I'm like, is it? There wasn't as much of a specific threat in that kind of case at all. And the amount of money that show loses absolutely boggles the mind. It is impossible to imagine squandering that much money on a daily basis. So Economics was doing just fine. You didn't have to go after him.
Yeah, this is an implied threat. Brendan Carr does not have to go up and say, we will revoke your license unless you do X, and then provide a list and a bunch of bullet points about what you have to do in order to keep your license. If Brendan Carr is on a podcast saying, look, I've heard suspension is in the air. Some people are talking about firing. I don't know. But Disney has a real problem here, and the affiliates need to step up. That's what he said. The affiliates need to step up, right? He was strongly suggesting a course of action that he wanted the affiliates to take, and then he was within a couple of sentences saying, look, we are considering all sorts of action. He doesn't exactly say what. He doesn't make a specific threat, but it's so clearly an implied threat. And I just don't understand how anybody can deny that implied threat exists.
Yeah. And for me, it is very, very, not that very different at all from what Jen Psaki did day after day for a while in the White House. And the White House was doing a, not just whole of government, but I think whole of society effort to go after COVID-related misinformation. She singled out the dirty dozen misinformers on COVID and named them up there. There's a naming and shaming events by the White House, and and there was some like, they better do something, and they'd be asked like, well, what is going to be the consequence of that? And she was more like, we'll see, a little bit less like direct and threatening, but the threat was in the air, and I thought that was more than sufficient to get Murphy versus Missouri adjudicated in a different way that didn't have to do with standing. So I think that was a mistake, and we're living with that mistake.
I mean, the courts basically did say that the threats were too vague. They weren't, the government was not directly responsible or fully directly responsible. Maybe it had some influence here. The courts allowed that, but basically said it's not fully directly responsible for the decisions that were made by the social media companies. The social media companies were making their decisions for a variety of reasons in a complex context, and some of those reasons had nothing to do or not very much to do with the government, and that was the court's reasoning. And I think, I was hoping that the courts would rule differently here. But let's go back to the question of profits and of market forces here that you brought up, because this is also something that Donald Trump is saying. Donald Trump's argument here is, well, look, he's just being canceled because his show has this declining audience, right? We don't know if it's actually not profitable. We just know that Stephen Colbert was very expensive and not profitable. It's at least plausible that Jimmy Kimmel is in the same boat or was in the same boat, but we don't actually have the financials in the same way. But Trump's response, I believe today, was Jimmy Kimmel was fired because he had bad ratings more than anything else. They should have fired him a long time ago, so you can call that free speech or not. I'm going to guess you're going to call that not.
I mean, I might agree with him that Jimmy Kimmel should have been fired a long time ago. Yeah. And I also don't want the president of the United States weighing in on the hiring and firing decisions of pretty much anybody who doesn't work for the federal government, and especially anybody who works in the free speech and biz. It's just inappropriate. It's just flat inappropriate. And the chain of events that have happened in the last 3 days when it comes to the FCC, Donald Trump, the federal government, Jimmy Kimmel, ABC, and ABC's biggest affiliates, you don't need the crazy guy connecting yarn on the wall for this one. It's like, oh, that's how that happened. So I think Trump is wrong. And while also bringing up a point about long-term profitability, that's true. It's just not necessarily relevant to this conversation.
So where do you see this going? And in particular, how do you see this kind of affecting media companies, the culture of free speech, publishers? Because this isn't just Trump, the Trump appointee leaning on the affiliates who then fold, that causes, the dominoes to hit ABC, which pulls Jimmy Kimmel off the air. This is also, Donald Trump is celebrating this as, quote, great news for America. And then he's not just celebrating this happening, he's also suggesting that more late night hosts who didn't say anything, as far as I know, or at least I should say, they didn't say anything that has been singled out as particularly offensive by the right and by Trump about Charlie Kirk. There's no clear proximate cause. Not that I think that the Kirk joke, to be clear, or the Kirk remark, just to be clear, that was not okay. And I even think it would have been reasonable for a supervisor, whoever it is in charge of Jimmy Kimmel, to suspend him, to punish him in some way. But to do this after the threat, it is the threat from Brendan Carr, the threat from the government that makes this different here. But Trump is now saying it's not just that it's great that Kimmel's gone. It's that leaves Jimmy and Seth two total losers on fake news NBC. Their ratings are horrible. Do it, NBC. He doesn't specify what do it is, but that seems like pretty clearly a command to take them off the air too.
Sure. And I think that Jimmy Kimmel's job status and the fate of America don't have a lot in common. But the exercise of that power serially now by the president of the United States, FCC, and etc., is tangibly bad for America. There was a phrase that went around before the election by Democrats that I poo-pooed a lot, and I still think that it was inaccurate at the time, which was anticipatory obedience. Because they were talking about, they were using that in the context of the Washington Post 3 or 4 weeks before the election, deciding that they're not going to run an editorial endorsing one presidential candidate or another. Like, okay, that's just Jeff Bezos, the owner, doing anticipatory obedience because he doesn't want to cross Donald Trump. I didn't think that there was evidence for that necessarily at the time, and so I kind of mocked it. Also, it's a funny sounding phrase. I think there is anticipatory obedience now. Donald Trump is, I mean, the fact that CBS settled the absolutely frivolous lawsuit against 60 Minutes about its editing, absolutely frivolous, one that Brendan Carr totally thought was great, settled that in part because there was a merger that they wanted to settle. First of all, I think a lot of media companies are looking at this, especially the larger ones that have a lot of business with the federal government. They don't want the hassle. So Trump is out there suing and pressuring, and people are responding. This is a great time for smaller media and for people to fight back. I mean, I was talking with Greg Luciano from the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression this morning, and he pointed out, we were talking about the law firm stuff, that the few law firms who have actually fought these strong-arm attempts by the Trump administration have been successful. You can find success in the courts going against this. There will be success against Donald Trump in the way that he's crashing about with free speech, First Amendment, job owning, and et cetera. That's going to happen. I feel very confident in saying that. But in the meantime, the overall culture for free speech and the behavior, particularly by deep-pocketed corporations, is going to be considerably more fearful. And that sucks. I would point out Charlie Kirk, who I did not know, he was lampooned on South Park a couple episodes back of this season, and as a master debater, and they did his hair and everything like that. His reaction to that was fantastic. It was like, "That's awesome! It's South Park." It's great that they mentioned me because you spell my name right. That's good. But he took it in extremely good humor. I don't know anything about him, his personal ideas about late night comedy or even censoriousness, but a guy who was sort of committed to the exchange of ideas on college campuses, who reacted to him being mocked on television in just a really good spirited way. It's a little bit hard to imagine him being super stoked about a wave of censoriousness coming down out of people in response. It seems kind of counterintuitive to the message that he was trying to spread, and it's just counterintuitive to what we're supposed to do in America. We're supposed to make fun of people and color outside the lines when doing it. What was out of bounds culturally was the wave of madness that peaked in 2020 at cultural institutions, where we're suddenly defenestrating people for the most imagined of slights, or the slights of their spouses in some cases. Just a really abysmal behavior. That wave has been rolling back for quite some time now. And I think having some faith in the American way of doing things, as articulated by J.D. Vance in Europe, and as opposed to how Europe is doing it, that way lies not just the future, but just like what feels comfortable and normal as Americans. This overreach, even though there's going to be a lot of gutless people on the right who will either look the other way or, God help us all, apologize for it, aid and abet it, they're going to find themselves vastly outnumbered by Americans who are used to cheeky humor, especially and above all about people who would pretend to have power or any kind of moral authority over the rest of us.
Okay, so what do you say to the people who are saying in our comments right now, Jimmy Kimmel was wrong? That was offensive. It was uncalled for, and these are public airwaves that he doesn't have a right to. He doesn't have a right to that job, right? This is the sort of the phrase of art that has gone around is freedom of speech, not freedom of reach. And so we've got two folks here in our comments who are saying the lying was offensive. I assume he means Kimmel, he knew the suspect wasn't a right winger. And then a follow-up comment from somebody else who says, I think news stations should be able to fire liars. What do you say to that?
News stations can fire liars all they want. Please do fire more of them. That's great. I think that a lot of news stations would work a lot better. Karen Attiah from the Washington Post was fired in their opinion section. the other day, and this came right after she had a quote from Charlie Kirk, and two of the words, at least in the quotation mark, he didn't say. I'm fine with firing that person. If that person's on my staff. I was again asking Greg Lukianoff today, what would have happened if one of your staffers was out there publicly celebrating the death of Charlie Kirk? Mr. Anti-cancel culture. What say you? It's like, fucking fire him. I mean, yeah, you have decency and standards, and go for it. The public airwaves remark. I have seen this argument made for 30 years by the Ralph Naderite left, by the Robert McChesney, the late Robert McChesney left. He was a media critic and theorist, far to the left of most people, and they will say the public airwaves should be used in this way, and it's a right, or it's a privilege, not a right. My question is just going to be, work your mind through the enforceability of all of this. I think even Carr was saying that, like, this is going to make media better because it's going to make them more truthful. You can't just be on the public airwaves saying things that are untrue.
Well, I mean, we should actually respond to his argument there, because what Carr said wasn't just that it's going to make media more truthful. What he said was trust in media is so low right now that this kind of enforcement of the public standards, or whatever it is, right, like the sort of public standard here, is going to make the media better. It's going to be good for them because it's going to improve public trust in the media.
Yeah, he said another thing that was talking about a standard of truthfulness as part of the public interest, and what is the enforcement mechanism for that? Are you going to have some truth bans out there? Imagine how pear-shaped the fact-checking industry has gotten over the past 15 years. Politically,
Federal Commission of Truth. This would be great.
This actually was suggested very often in 2021 and 2022 by the likes of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She wanted a truth czar. Remember the jazz hands gal who's on the misinformation czar?
I believe you were talking about Nina Jankowicz.
Yes, Nina Jazz Handzowicz. There was a government body that was interested in the level of truthness by people expressing public airwaves, or even on a fora like this. What did that body do? That body engaged serially in misinformation of its own and punished people who corrected that misinformation. I dare suggest that that is the model of what would happen no matter who is in charge. It's going to be lopsided against whoever that administration perceives is its political opponents. It's going to be incredibly selective of who is being decent, who is saying something that is true, who is saying something that's not true. And as far as I can tell, even the Jimmy Kimmel quote was like, MAGA people out there are trying to convince everybody that this kid wasn't MAGA. I think that's a bad thing to say. I was passing around the clip before this became a political controversy to various people and saying, can you believe this guy? Also, in a court of law, is he wrong? MAGA people were passing around things that was showing that this guy wasn't MAGA. He's actually saying something that's true, but you know what he means. What he means is that was untrue, what they were trying to spread, although he didn't state that explicitly. Regardless, we're splitting hairs on what a ill-watched late-night comedian said. That's not a good place to be. Governments that are that interested in the quality and content of jokes on late-night television are not good governments. The amount of free speech in regimes where that happens is not good. That's not a path we want to go down to. At all. It's not just imagine the other guys are in charge, but you should do that as unpopular that is to imagine, even though it just happened, people. It really just happened. They did all the things, and they were terrible things, and we oppose them just like we oppose this. But also, just file it against your American standard. We're Americans, right? We were against the notion of seditious libel, that you should be punished by attacking the king. We were against that in these colonies while we were still under the thumb of the king. And we had courts rule in our favor. It's like, you know what, Americans, you guys are weird. You're a little bit different. You're a little bit more, yeah, I don't know what the word insouciant means, but that, we're cheeky.
The real challenge is to spell it.
Yeah, it is. Let them pronounce it. We have established this tradition of being more critical of the people who would deem lead us, including people who actually had the legal right there for a half a second. And that's a good tradition worth keeping. I don't want to squander that tradition by policing the freaking jokes of people. Come on.
Yeah, we've got about 2 minutes here. I just want you to take us out on a note, because this about Charlie Kirk, because your point earlier about how Charlie Kirk, when he was mocked, made fun of, when he was turned into a sort of ridiculous cartoon character on South Park, which mocks and makes fun of everybody in a kind of happy, joyful, sometimes critical as well way, right? His response was the right response here. And this response from the Trump administration, from Donald Trump to celebrate the firing or suspension of a comedian, for Brendan Carr, as sort of the FCC enforcer for Trump, to push for something like this to happen, to kind of lean on the stations. That is the wrong response here. And it feels like there is a clear contrast between Donald Trump, who psychologically cannot take it, and we are living in his psychodrama, and it's just even more of a shame. It makes Charlie Kirk's already tragic passing even worse in some ways, even sadder, to think that Charlie Kirk was doing this right. Charlie Kirk had the right idea to say, hey, that's funny, let's laugh at this, and then to go back and debate people and try and make his case through speech and through debate and through argument. And that just seems to me like that's the way that's the person to model here. And it's a damn shame that Donald Trump can't see that. Take us home.
Amen, Peter Suderman.
All right. Amen. I don't know about that. Probably Brendan Carr would like us ending with an amen, but thank you all for tuning in. This is going to be archived and you'll be able to watch it later if you've not, if you want to go back to it. Thank you all for your questions and for your comments, even the ones that disagree with us, because we think disagreement is good. Thank you so much to Matt Welch. This has been a special live edition of the Reason Roundtable. Reason Roundtable will return on Monday as normally scheduled. Tune in, subscribe to our YouTube, all that stuff. I'm Peter Suderman. Thank you so much.